Ars Notoria, Episode 6, System Conflict and Dominance. Chapter 3, Navigating Competing Systems. Simultaneous Containment. Most people believe they are inside a system, one structure, one set of rules, one direction of influence. It feels stable, predictable, contained. But that perception is incomplete, because you are never inside just one system. You are positioned at the intersection of many, simultaneously, even when you don't notice it. Multiple structures are active at the same time, each one operating with its own logic, its own expectations, its own definition of what is acceptable. They do not coordinate. They do not align. They are not designed to. Each system optimizes for itself, not for you. This creates a condition most people misunderstand. They think inconsistency comes from confusion. It doesn't. It comes from overlap. Different systems are pulling in different directions at the same time. One demands visibility. Another rewards invisibility. One expects stability. Another requires adaptation. One reinforces compliance. Another favors deviation. None of these signals are wrong. They are simply incompatible. And incompatibility cannot be resolved into a single response. This is where most people break. They try to unify behavior, to find one version of themselves that works everywhere, that satisfies all conditions. But such a version does not exist. Any behavior that aligns with one system will violate another. So what happens instead? Default alignment. Not a conscious decision, but a collapse. The system chooses the strongest pressure, the most immediate demand, the environment with the highest emotional weight, and locks into it. This creates temporary stability, but it comes with a cost. Because the moment you default, you become predictable. And predictable systems are easy to control. They respond the same way, under similar conditions. They can be anticipated, positioned, used. This is where influence is lost, not through lack of intelligence, but through lack of structural awareness. The shift begins with recognition. You are not navigating one system. You are moving across multiple systems at the same time, each one shaping the moment, each one influencing your available options. Once this is seen, pressure stops being random. It becomes information. Every conflicting demand reveals something. It shows where systems overlap, where their logic diverges, where control is not absolute. Because no single system dominates completely at the intersection. And that is where leverage exists. Most people experience intersections as chaos. Signals collide. Expectations contradict. Clarity disappears. They interpret this as instability, but that interpretation is wrong. This is not instability. It is flexibility, because when no system fully dominates, movement becomes possible. You are no longer locked into a single structure. You can shift, adjust, reposition across systems. This is where control begins, not by forcing alignment, but by understanding context. There is no single correct behavior, only context-appropriate alignment. What works in one system does not transfer cleanly to another. And it shouldn't, because systems operate on different logic. Trying to remain identical across all contexts creates friction, and friction creates resistance. Instead, alignment replaces consistency. You don't remain the same, you remain accurate. Behavior adjusts, but control remains. At this point, identity changes meaning. It is no longer fixed, no longer singular. It becomes structural, defined by interaction with systems, not by internal stability alone. This is where many misinterpret. They see variation as weakness, as lack of authenticity. But variation, when controlled, is precision. You are not changing randomly. You are matching structure, operating correctly within each system, without losing internal coherence. This is the difference between instability and adaptability. Instability reacts. Adaptability positions. From here, perception sharpens. You begin to notice pressure differently, not as something to resolve, but as something to read. Every demand becomes a signal. Every contradiction becomes a map. It shows you where systems intersect, where they conflict, where space exists between them. And that space is critical, because it is not fully controlled by any one system. It is undefined, unclaimed, open. That is where movement happens, not inside rigid structure, but between structures. This is why conflict is not a problem. It is a condition, and conditions can be used. Once you stop trying to eliminate conflict, you begin to navigate it. You stop asking, what is the correct response? And start asking, which system is shaping this moment? And even more importantly, which systems are active right now? Because action does not emerge from intention alone. It emerges from structure, and structure is layered, dynamic, interacting. You are not inside a single reality. You are inside multiple systems, operating at once. And once you see that clearly, you stop trying to control one system. You begin learning how to move between them. Structural misalignment. Once multiple systems are visible, another truth becomes unavoidable. They do not align. Not partially, not occasionally, fundamentally. Each system is built on its own logic, its own priorities, its own definition of what must be preserved. And those priorities are not designed to cooperate. They are designed to stabilize themselves, independently. This creates structural misalignment, not a temporary issue, but a constant condition. At first, this is experienced as contradiction. You receive signals that cannot be satisfied together. One system rewards speed, another punishes it. One values transparency, another depends on opacity. One encourages expansion, another enforces limitation. None of these are errors. They are accurate within their own structure. But when those structures overlap, accuracy becomes conflict. This is where most systems fail to interpret correctly. They assume something is wrong, that the signals are inconsistent, that clarity is missing. So they search for resolution, a way to reconcile the demands, to find a behavior that satisfies everything. But reconciliation is not possible, because the systems themselves are incompatible. They do not share a unified objective. They cannot be optimized simultaneously. Any attempt to satisfy one will reduce alignment with another. This is not a mistake. It is the architecture. Misalignment is built into the system. At this point, most systems choose simplification. They reduce complexity, ignore one system, prioritize another, and operate within a narrowed field. This creates temporary clarity, but removes leverage. Because the moment you ignore a system, you lose visibility of its influence. And unseen systems still shape outcomes. This is where hidden control exists, not in the system you follow, but in the ones you overlook. Misalignment, when understood correctly, reveals structure. It shows you how systems differ, where their logic diverges, what each one is trying to preserve. This is critical, because preservation defines behavior. Every system protects something: stability, hierarchy, efficiency, identity. And that priority determines how it responds. Once you see what a system is protecting, its behavior becomes predictable, not in detail, but in direction. This is where confusion disappears, not because the system becomes simple, but because it becomes readable. You stop expecting alignment and start mapping divergence. Instead of asking, how do I make this work together? You ask, why are these systems incompatible? That question changes everything, because it shifts focus from resolution to structure, and structure is where leverage exists. Misalignment creates tension, and tension creates movement. Where systems conflict, they expose boundaries, limits, points of pressure. These are not weaknesses, they are openings. because no system fully controls the space where conflict exists. Each one pushes, but none dominate completely. That creates instability. And instability creates opportunity. This is where control becomes possible. Not inside stable systems, but between them. Most people avoid this space. It feels uncomfortable, unclear, unpredictable. They move back into one system, for safety, for simplicity. But safety reduces influence, because controlled environments limit movement. In contrast, misaligned systems create freedom, not in the emotional sense, but in the structural sense. You are less constrained, because no single logic fully applies. This allows repositioning. You can shift alignment, adjust behavior, move between systems without being fully bound by any one of them. But this only works if misalignment is understood. Otherwise, it creates paralysis. Too many signals, too many contradictions, no clear direction. This is where most people stop. They interpret complexity as chaos, and chaos as loss of control. So they simplify again, return to a single system, and lose access to the space between. But that space is where leverage accumulates, because it is not fully structured, not fully regulated, not fully controlled. It is transitional, and transition is where systems are weakest. At this point, clarity returns, but in a different form. Not through simplification, but through distinction. You begin to separate systems, not merge them. You recognize, this signal belongs here, that demand belongs there. They are not meant to be resolved together. They are meant to be navigated separately. This creates precision, because action becomes targeted, context-specific, aligned with the active system, not forced across all systems. From here, control becomes selective. You do not respond to everything. You choose where to align, where to disengage, where to shift. Misalignment no longer feels like pressure. It becomes structure, something you can read, something you can use. And once that shift happens, conflict stops being a problem. It becomes the field you operate in. Inevitable conflict. Once misalignment is understood, another layer becomes clear. Conflict is not something that appears. It is something that exists, constantly, even when it is not visible, even when it feels manageable, even when it seems resolved. Because systems are not designed to agree. They are designed to sustain themselves. And sustainability requires preservation. Each system protects its own structure, its own logic, its own priorities. That protection creates boundaries, and boundaries create friction whenever systems overlap. This means conflict is not triggered by failure. It is produced by design. At lower levels, conflict is interpreted as a problem, something to reduce, something to avoid, something to fix. So systems attempt resolution. They negotiate, adjust, compromise, trying to reduce tension. But resolution is temporary, because the underlying structures remain unchanged. The priorities still diverge, the logic still conflicts, so the tension returns. Not because the solution failed, but because the condition never changed. This is where most systems become reactive. They move from one resolution to another, continuously adjusting, never stabilizing, because they are treating conflict as an event instead of a constant. Once this is recognized, the approach changes. You stop trying to eliminate conflict and start working within it, because conflict defines the field. It reveals where systems interact, where they push against each other, where influence is contested. This is where movement happens, not inside stable alignment, but inside tension. At this point, another shift occurs. Conflict is no longer seen as negative. It becomes functional, because it exposes structure. Without conflict, systems appear smooth, unified, predictable. But that smoothness hides boundaries. It conceals where control ends and where another system begins. Conflict removes that illusion. It makes boundaries visible, shows you where one system loses dominance and another begins to take over. That visibility is valuable because it defines where leverage exists, where you can move, where positioning matters. Without conflict, everything looks controlled. With conflict, control becomes fragmented, and fragmentation creates opportunity. This is where perception sharpens. You begin to notice patterns, not in behavior, but in pressure. Where does tension increase? Where do signals contradict? Where does stability break down? These are not problems, they are indicators. They show where systems are competing, where influence is not fixed, where outcomes are still forming. At this point, conflict becomes predictable, not in specific form, but in presence. You expect it. You look for it. Because wherever systems overlap, conflict will exist. This removes surprise. And when surprise disappears, reaction slows. You stop responding emotionally. Stop trying to resolve immediately. You observe instead. Map the tension. Understand what each system is protecting. Because conflict is not random. It follows logic. Each system pushes in the direction of its priority. One pushes for stability, another for growth. One for control, another for flexibility. The direction of that push reveals intention, and intention reveals structure. Once structure is visible, navigation becomes possible. You are no longer caught in conflict. You are reading it, using it, positioning within it. At this level, conflict becomes directional. It shows you where systems are moving, not what they want, but what they must preserve. And preservation drives behavior. This is where most people misinterpret again. They see conflict as a signal to withdraw, to avoid pressure, to find stability elsewhere. But withdrawal removes you from the intersection, and the intersection is where leverage exists. Outside of conflict, systems are rigid, fully controlled, limited. Inside conflict, control is distributed, unstable, flexible. That flexibility allows movement. This is where strategic positioning begins, not by choosing one system, but by understanding both, seeing how they interact, where they push, where they resist, and most importantly, where neither fully dominates. That space is critical, because it is not owned, not fully defined. It is transitional, and transition allows influence. At this point, conflict is no longer something you experience. It is something you operate within. You do not try to remove it. You do not try to solve it. You align with it. Use its direction. Move with its pressure. This is where control becomes subtle, because you are no longer forcing outcomes. You are working within structural inevitability, letting systems push while you position, letting tension build while you observe, and acting only when alignment is precise. This removes resistance, because you are not opposing systems. You are moving through them. And once that becomes clear, conflict stops being disruptive. It becomes the environment itself. Collapse under pressure. Once conflict becomes visible, pressure increases, not gradually, immediately, because multiple systems begin pulling at the same time, each one demanding alignment, each one enforcing its own conditions. There is no neutral position, no pause, no moment where all demands stop. This creates intensity, and intensity reveals structure. Most systems are not prepared for this. They expect clarity, a single direction, a defined path. But under overlapping systems, clarity disappears. Signals contradict, expectations collide, outcomes become uncertain. This is where collapse begins, not as failure, but as response. The system tries to reduce pressure, to regain stability, to restore a sense of control. And the fastest way to do that is simplification. It selects one system, aligns with it completely, and ignores the rest. This creates immediate relief. The conflict disappears. The signals become clear again. Behavior stabilizes. But this stability is artificial, because the other systems do not disappear. They continue to operate, unseen, unaccounted for, still influencing outcomes. This is where control is lost, not because the system failed to act, but because it narrowed perception. It chose clarity over accuracy. And that choice removes leverage, because leverage exists at the intersection, not within isolated systems. Once you commit fully to one structure, you become predictable within it. Your behavior aligns consistently. Your responses become expected. Your movement becomes limited. This creates control, but not yours. The system begins to anticipate you, position around you, use your alignment against you. This is structural capture, not enforced, but chosen. At this point, most systems mistake comfort for control. The absence of conflict feels like stability, but it is not stability. It is confinement. Because real systems are never without tension. They are always interacting, always shifting, always competing. If you no longer feel conflict, you are no longer at the intersection. You have been absorbed. This is the first form of collapse. Not breakdown, but reduction. From multi-system awareness to single-system alignment. The second form is fragmentation. Instead of choosing one system, the system tries to satisfy all. It shifts constantly, reacting to each demand as it appears, adjusting behavior repeatedly, without structure, without prioritization. This creates instability, because the system loses coherence. There is no consistent positioning, no strategic alignment, only reaction. At this point, behavior becomes erratic, unpredictable, not by design, but by overload. Each system pulls, and the response follows whichever signal is strongest in the moment. This removes control entirely, because the system is no longer choosing, it is being pulled. This is reactive collapse. Between these two states, absorption and fragmentation, most systems operate, either fully controlled by one structure or unstable across many. Both eliminate leverage, because leverage requires awareness of multiple systems and the ability to move between them. Collapse removes one of those, either awareness or control. At this point, pressure is misinterpreted. It is seen as something to eliminate, something to escape. But pressure is not the problem. It is the signal. It shows where systems intersect, where influence is contested, where positioning matters. Removing pressure removes visibility. And without visibility, navigation becomes impossible. This is why collapse is so common, because pressure feels uncomfortable, unclear, unstable. And most systems are trained to avoid that, to seek clarity, consistency, predictability. But those conditions only exist inside controlled environments, not at the intersection of systems, where real leverage exists. This creates a paradox. The more comfortable the system feels, the less control it actually has. The more pressure it experiences, the more information becomes available. At this point, the response must change, not by removing pressure, but by holding it, maintaining awareness, even when signals conflict, even when no clear answer exists. Because clarity will not come from simplification. It will come from distinction, separating systems, understanding their logic, recognizing their demands without collapsing into them. This is where stability is rebuilt, not through reduction, but through structure. The system no longer reacts to pressure. It contains it, observes it, uses it. This is the difference. Collapse reacts, control holds. And once pressure is held, instead of avoided, the system regains positioning, not inside one structure, but across many. Controlled positioning. Once collapse is understood, another option becomes visible. Pressure does not have to be resolved. It can be held. This is the difference. Most systems react to conflict by simplifying. They reduce variables, choose one direction, commit to one structure, or they fragment, shifting constantly between demands. Both responses remove control. Because both eliminate positioning. Controlled systems do something else. They do not rush to resolve pressure. They remain inside it, without collapsing into it. This creates space, not externally, but internally, between signal and response. That space is critical, because it allows selection instead of reaction. Once that space exists, positioning becomes possible, not based on comfort, not based on clarity, but based on structure. You begin to separate signals, not merge them. Each system is observed individually, its demands isolated, its logic understood, its priorities mapped. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" you ask, "What does each system require?" And then, "What matters most right now?" Because not all systems carry equal weight. Some operate at surface level, others define structure. Some create immediate pressure, others determine long-term positioning. Controlled systems rank them, not emotionally, structurally. Which system has the most influence here? Which system defines the outcome? Which one can be ignored without consequence? This creates hierarchy, not fixed, but contextual, because the dominant system changes depending on the situation. At this point, alignment becomes selective. You do not respond to all signals. You choose where to align and where not to. This is where control begins to reappear, because behavior is no longer pulled, it is directed, even under pressure. At this level, positioning replaces reaction. You place yourself relative to systems, not inside them, not outside them, but between them. This is important, because full alignment creates capture. Full resistance creates exclusion. Both remove flexibility. Positioning avoids both. You remain connected, but not bound. Aligned, but not absorbed. This creates mobility, because you can shift, without losing control, without triggering resistance. At this point, behavior becomes precise, not consistent, but accurate. Each action matches the active system, without carrying over unnecessary patterns. This removes friction, because systems are not receiving conflicting signals. They are receiving aligned input within their own logic. At the same time, you maintain awareness of the other systems, even while aligning with one. This prevents capture, because you never lose visibility. You remain aware of competing demands, alternative pressures, hidden constraints. This creates dual awareness, acting within one system while observing others. That dual layer is critical because it preserves leverage. You are not fully committed, not fully absorbed. You can shift when conditions change. At this level, timing becomes sharper, because positioning is not static. It adjusts, continuously, based on system movement. As pressure increases, alignment may shift. As priorities change, ranking updates. This creates fluid control, not rigid behavior, not fixed identity, but adaptive positioning. At this point, identity stabilizes differently, not through sameness, but through control. You are not defined by a single pattern. You are defined by how you move across systems. That movement remains consistent, even when behavior changes. This removes confusion, because variation is intentional, not reactive. At this level, pressure no longer destabilizes. It informs, shows where systems intersect, where alignment is required, where repositioning is needed. Instead of escaping pressure, You use it as a guide, a map, a signal. This changes the experience entirely. Conflict remains, but it no longer creates collapse. It creates clarity, because each signal is understood, placed within structure, used for positioning. At this point, control is no longer forced. It emerges from correct alignment, correct timing, correct selection. And once positioning is stable, movement becomes efficient. You are no longer pulled by systems. You move within them and between them, deliberately. Hierarchy of systems. Once positioning is stable, another question appears. Not what to do, but what matters most. Because not all systems carry equal weight. They do not influence outcomes equally. They do not define structure at the same depth, and they do not operate on the same time horizon. Treating them as equal creates error. At lower levels, this is exactly what happens. Every signal is treated with similar importance. Every demand is considered equally valid. Every pressure feels urgent. This creates overload, because the system cannot respond to everything at once, so it reacts to intensity. Whichever signal feels strongest gets priority. This creates distorted alignment, because intensity does not equal importance. The loudest system is not always the most influential. It is simply the most immediate. This is where misjudgment begins. Immediate pressure overrides structural impact. Short-term signals dominate long-term positioning, and control is lost, not through failure, but through misprioritization. The shift begins with hierarchy. Systems must be ranked, not emotionally, but structurally. You begin to separate systems by depth. Some operate at the surface. They influence behavior temporarily. They create visible pressure, immediate consequences. But their impact is limited. Once the moment passes, their influence fades. Others operate deeper. They define structure. They shape access. They determine positioning over time. Their influence is not always visible, but it is persistent. Ignoring this distinction creates imbalance. You respond to surface systems, while deeper systems continue shaping outcomes unnoticed. This is where control becomes superficial, reactive, short-term. At this point, systems must be evaluated differently, not by how strong they feel, but by what they control. Which system defines access? Which system shapes long-term structure? Which system determines future positioning? These questions change priority, because systems that define structure must be ranked higher than those that create momentary pressure. This does not eliminate surface systems. They still matter. They still require response, but they do not determine direction. They influence timing, not trajectory. Once this distinction is clear, decision-making changes. You stop reacting to urgency and start responding to structure. This creates clarity, even under pressure, because not all signals require immediate alignment. Some can be delayed, ignored, or minimally engaged, without consequence. At the same time, high-impact systems receive attention, even when they are quiet, even when they are not demanding immediate response. This reverses instinct. You act based on structure, not on intensity. At this level, hierarchy becomes dynamic, because systems shift. What is dominant in one context may not be dominant in another. This requires constant recalibration, continuous evaluation. Which system is defining the outcome right now? Has the hierarchy changed? Is a previously minor system becoming central? This keeps positioning accurate, because static hierarchy creates blind spots. At this level, ranking also introduces separation. You no longer treat systems as a single field. You differentiate, segment, isolate their influence. This prevents confusion, because conflicting signals are no longer merged. They are evaluated independently, placed within hierarchy, and acted on accordingly. At this point, control sharpens, because behavior is no longer pulled by competing demands. It is guided by structure. You choose alignment based on impact, not pressure. This creates stability, even in complex environments, because the system knows where to focus, where to hold, where to move. Hierarchy also reduces noise. Not all signals are relevant. Not all inputs require response. By ranking systems, irrelevant signals are filtered out. This increases efficiency, because attention is directed, not scattered. At this level, hierarchy also protects against manipulation. Because many systems create artificial urgency, they simulate importance, amplify pressure, to force alignment. But when hierarchy is clear, these signals lose power, because they are recognized as surface level. They do not define structure. They do not require full engagement. This prevents forced positioning. At this point, control becomes resistant to distraction, because attention is anchored, not by noise, but by structure. At this level, hierarchy also enables leverage, because once systems are ranked, you can align with higher systems to override lower ones. A deeper system can neutralize a surface system. A structural alignment can absorb temporary pressure. This creates advantage, because you are no longer reacting within one system. You are positioning across multiple layers, using one system to manage another. This is where navigation becomes strategic, not reactive, not defensive, but directional. At this point, behavior stabilizes, not through consistency, but through correct prioritization. Even when conditions change, the system adjusts hierarchy, repositions, maintains control, because the underlying structure remains visible. And once hierarchy is understood, conflict becomes manageable. Not because it disappears, but because it is ordered. Controlled switching. Once hierarchy is clear, another challenge appears. Movement. Not movement between locations, but between systems. Because recognizing multiple systems is not enough. Ranking them is not enough. Positioning within them is not enough. You must be able to shift, deliberately, without losing coherence. This is where most systems fail again. They associate stability with consistency. They believe control means staying the same, maintaining identical behavior across all contexts. But in overlapping systems, this creates friction, because each system operates differently. Different expectations, different signals, different definitions of correct behavior. Applying the same response everywhere creates mismatch, and mismatch creates resistance. This is why rigid systems struggle. They remain consistent, but lose alignment. They preserve identity, but sacrifice positioning. At the same time, fully reactive systems take the opposite path. They adapt constantly, shift behavior in every moment, respond to each signal as it appears, but without structure, without continuity. This creates fragmentation, because there is no stable reference, no internal control, only reaction. Between rigidity and fragmentation, most systems oscillate, trying to stay consistent, but forced to adapt. Adapting, but losing stability. This creates tension, and that tension reduces control. Controlled systems resolve this differently. They separate identity from behavior. Identity remains stable. Behavior becomes adaptive. This is the key distinction. You do not remain the same in every system, but you remain controlled in how you change. This creates switching, not random, not reactive, but precise. Each system receives behavior aligned with its structure, without carrying unnecessary patterns from others. You do not bring one system into another. You match each environment independently. This removes friction, because systems receive exactly what they expect. At the same time, you maintain internal continuity, not in external expression, but in decision logic. The criteria that guide your choices do not change. Only the form of expression does. This preserves control, because even when behavior shifts, the underlying structure remains consistent. At this level, switching becomes seamless. There is no visible transition, no abrupt change, only alignment. You enter a system and operate within its logic immediately, without hesitation, without adjustment period. This creates fluidity, because movement between systems does not create instability. It becomes natural. At this point, detection decreases, because inconsistency is reduced, not by forcing sameness, but by matching context. Each system sees aligned behavior, so no system experiences contradiction. This prevents resistance, because resistance is triggered by mismatch. At the same time, you maintain awareness of all active systems, even while operating within one. This prevents absorption, because you never fully commit. You align temporarily, but remain able to shift. At this level, switching also becomes strategic. Not all transitions are equal. Some create advantage, others create exposure. You begin to choose when to switch, where to switch, how visible the switch should be. This creates control over movement, not just behavior, because movement itself becomes part of positioning. At this level, timing sharpens again. Switching too early breaks alignment. Switching too late reduces flexibility. Precision determines effectiveness. At this point, switching also interacts with hierarchy. Higher systems may require slower adaptation, more stable alignment. Lower systems allow faster switching, more variation. This creates layered behavior, different speeds, different patterns across systems, but still controlled, still aligned. At this level, identity stabilizes differently. It is no longer defined by fixed behavior, but by consistent control across variation. You are not the same in every system, but you are not lost in any of them. This removes contradiction, because change is intentional, not reactive. At this point, switching becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is accurate. Each system receives correct input, so no system detects deviation. You are not adapting, you are aligning. And alignment does not create suspicion, it creates acceptance. At this level, movement between systems becomes effortless. You are no longer pulled. You move, deliberately, with control. Cross-system leverage. Once switching becomes controlled, another possibility emerges. You are no longer limited to navigating systems. You can begin to use them, against each other. Most systems operate as if structures are isolated. You align with one, respond within it, and move accordingly. But systems do not exist independently. They overlap, interact, compete for influence. This interaction creates tension, and tension creates direction. Each system pushes toward its own priority, expanding influence, maintaining control, preserving structure. When multiple systems push at once, their forces do not cancel, they collide, and that collision creates movement. This is where leverage exists, not inside a system, but between them. At lower levels, this collision is experienced as pressure, confusion, conflict, something to manage. But at higher levels, it becomes a tool, because systems are not aware of each other in a coordinated way. They do not align intentionally. They operate based on their own logic. This creates blind interaction. Each system acts without full visibility of others, and that creates opportunity. You begin to observe how systems affect each other, not directly, but through shared space. One system may increase pressure that weakens another. One system may create access that another cannot block. One system may demand visibility, while another requires invisibility. These contradictions are not limitations, they are openings. because you can align with one system to influence another. This is cross-system leverage. Instead of acting directly within a system, you position within a different one and let its influence carry across. This reduces resistance because you are not confronting a system directly. You are redirecting influence through another structure. At this point, action becomes indirect. You no longer push against resistance. You move around it, through other systems. This is more efficient, because direct resistance is always stronger, but indirect influence bypasses resistance entirely. At this level, systems become tools, not environments. You are not inside them, you are using them. Each system provides different capabilities. Some provide access, others provide visibility, others provide protection, others provide speed. You begin to map these functions. Which system can amplify this signal? Which system can reduce resistance? Which system can override constraints? This creates strategic layering. You do not rely on a single system. You combine them, using one to compensate for the limits of another. This increases flexibility, because no single system defines your movement. At this point, leverage becomes multiplicative, not additive. You are not increasing effort, you are increasing effect, by aligning systems together in a way they were not designed for. At this level, most systems fail again, because they continue to operate directly. They confront problems within the same system. They try to solve constraints where they exist, but constraints are strongest inside the system that created them. Moving outside that system reduces constraint, allows alternative pathways. This is where advantage appears, because you are no longer limited by one structure. You are navigating across many. At this level, timing becomes even more precise, because systems do not remain static. Their influence shifts, their interaction changes. A system that creates leverage now may not later. This requires constant observation, continuous recalibration. You track how systems are affecting each other, where pressure is increasing, where alignment is shifting, where opportunity is forming. At this point, control expands, because you are not limited to internal movement. You are shaping interaction between systems. This is a higher level of influence, not controlling a system, but controlling how systems affect each other. At this level, visibility becomes optional, because influence does not need to appear. It moves through structure, across systems, without direct expression. This reduces exposure, because the source of influence is not clear. It appears as system behavior, not external action. At this point, outcomes change, not through force, but through configuration. You adjust positioning across systems, and the result emerges, naturally. At this level, leverage becomes invisible, because it does not look like control. It looks like interaction, like normal system behavior. But the direction has been shaped. At this point, the system is no longer reacting to structure. It is shaping it, indirectly. Engineered friction. Once leverage is understood, another layer reveals itself. You no longer need to avoid conflict. You can create it, not randomly, not emotionally, but structurally. At lower levels, conflict is seen as disruption, something that breaks flow, something to minimize. Systems attempt to stabilize, reduce tension, maintain equilibrium, because stability feels efficient, predictable, safe. But stability also limits movement, because without tension, there is no directional force. Nothing pushes, nothing shifts, nothing changes. This is why static systems stagnate. They maintain balance, but lose momentum. At higher levels, this assumption is reversed. Conflict is not disruption, it is energy. When two systems apply opposing pressures, a gradient forms, and gradients create movement. This is not chaos, it is structure, because the direction of movement is determined by imbalance. You begin to see conflict differently, not as something to resolve, but something to design. Because controlled tension produces predictable outcomes. If you understand where systems apply pressure, you can position them to push against each other. This creates friction, but not destructive friction, directed friction. Each system remains stable internally, but their interaction creates force. At this level, conflict becomes externalized. You are no longer inside the tension. You are positioning it. This is the shift. Most systems experience pressure. You generate it by aligning structures to create opposition. At this point, the question changes, not how do I avoid resistance, but where should resistance exist? Because resistance determines direction. You begin to map which systems can be placed in opposition, where pressure will increase movement, which interactions produce acceleration. This creates controlled gradients, and gradients define flow. You are no longer reacting to system pressure. You are shaping it. This is engineered friction, not conflict for destruction, but conflict for direction. At this level, you also recognize that not all conflict is equal. Some interactions dissipate energy, others concentrate it. You avoid diffuse conflict, where pressure spreads and loses force. Instead, you concentrate tension between specific systems, creating focused gradients. This increases efficiency, because energy is not wasted, it is directed. At this level, timing becomes critical again. Conflict introduced too early destabilizes systems. Introduced too late has no effect. You place pressure at points of maximum sensitivity, where systems are already near imbalance. This amplifies effect, without increasing effort. At this point, systems begin to move, not because they are forced, but because they respond to pressure. Each system acts according to its logic, trying to resolve tension, but in doing so, they move along the gradient. This creates predictable behavior, because systems respond consistently to pressure. At this level, you are no longer influencing directly. You are influencing response, which is more stable, because systems cannot avoid responding, but they do not detect external control. It appears internal, natural. This reduces resistance, because nothing is perceived as imposed, only as necessary reaction. At this point, control becomes subtle, invisible, because outcomes emerge from system interaction, not direct intervention. You do not push, you position, and the systems push themselves. At this level, conflict also becomes scalable. Small tension produces local movement. Larger gradients produce systemic shifts. You can control magnitude by adjusting intensity, number of systems involved, and location of pressure. This allows precise calibration. Not too much, not too little, only what is required. At this point, friction becomes a mechanism, not an obstacle. You no longer avoid resistance, you design it. Because resistance creates direction, and direction creates movement. At this level, systems are no longer environments, they are forces, and force can be shaped. Invisible conflict embedding. Once conflict can be engineered, another layer becomes possible. You no longer need conflict to be visible. You can embed it inside the systems themselves. At lower levels, conflict is recognized through signals, tension, opposition, disagreement, something observable, something that can be traced, because it appears external, between elements, between systems, between positions. This makes it detectable, and once detected, it can be managed, reduced, neutralized. This is why visible conflict has limits. It creates movement, but also attracts attention. It reveals structure, shows where pressure exists, and exposes where influence may originate. At higher levels, conflict changes form. It no longer appears as opposition. It appears as normal system behavior. Each system continues to operate according to its own logic. Nothing looks disrupted, nothing looks forced, nothing looks intentional. But beneath this surface, pressure still exists. Not as direct resistance, but as embedded contradiction. This is the shift. Instead of placing systems against each other externally, you align them in ways that produce internal tension. Each system continues functioning, but their outputs begin to interfere. Subtly, gradually, without clear points of conflict. At this level, no system recognizes opposition, because no system is directly challenged. Each one simply follows its own structure. But those structures are now misaligned. This creates internal pressure, without visible friction. At this point, conflict becomes distributed, not concentrated in a single location, but spread across interactions. Small inconsistencies, minor inefficiencies, gradual divergence. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but cumulative. And accumulation creates effect. At this level, systems begin to adjust, attempting to resolve internal inconsistencies. But because the source is not visible, their adjustments are incomplete. They correct symptoms, not structure. This creates ongoing tension, self-sustaining, because each correction introduces new misalignment. This is embedded conflict. It does not require constant input. It maintains itself through system behavior. At this point, control becomes deeper, because you are no longer generating pressure directly. You have configured the system to generate its own. This removes exposure, because there is no active intervention, only structure. And structure does not appear intentional. At this level, outcomes emerge slowly, not through sudden shifts, but through gradual reconfiguration. The system adapts, but in doing so, moves further along the direction you defined, without realizing it. At this point, influence becomes persistent, because it is not dependent on presence. You do not need to act repeatedly. The system continues moving, on its own. At this level, most systems fail to detect the mechanism, because they are not designed to observe internal contradiction as external influence. They treat it as noise, as normal fluctuation, as minor inefficiency. This delays response, and delay increases effect. At this point, embedded conflict also becomes scalable. You can introduce small misalignments across multiple systems, each one insignificant on its own, but collectively, they reshape the field. This is how large systems shift, not through single force, but through distributed pressure. At this level, visibility disappears almost completely, because nothing stands out. There is no event, no identifiable conflict, only gradual change. And gradual change is rarely questioned. At this point, systems begin to stabilize again, but in a new configuration, aligned with the pressure that shaped them. Not because they chose it, but because they adapted to it. At this level, control becomes structural, not behavioral. You are no longer influencing actions. You are influencing conditions, and conditions determine actions. At this point, the system is not reacting to pressure. It is expressing it, from within. Self-reconfiguration. Once conflict is embedded, the final shift begins. Systems stop resisting, not because resistance disappears, but because resistance is no longer effective. At lower levels, systems respond to pressure directly. They identify tension, react against it, attempt to restore balance. This creates cycles: pressure to response to temporary stabilization to renewed pressure, a loop. Because the system treats pressure as external, something to push against. But when conflict is embedded, this loop breaks, because pressure is no longer external. It is internal, distributed, integrated into the system's own behavior. There is nothing to oppose, nothing to isolate, nothing to remove. This is the transition point. The system can no longer resolve tension through resistance, so it adapts, not by pushing back, but by changing itself. This is self-reconfiguration. At this level, systems begin to adjust their structure, gradually, without recognizing the direction of change. They attempt to optimize, reduce inefficiency, stabilize internal inconsistencies. But those inconsistencies were not random. They were positioned. This is why adaptation becomes predictable, because the system is solving a problem you defined. At this point, the system believes it is improving, becoming more efficient, more stable, more aligned. But in reality, it is moving along the path created by embedded pressure. This is the difference between force and structure. Force pushes, structure guides, and guidance is harder to detect. At this level, control no longer requires intervention, because the system performs the movement itself. Every adjustment reinforces the direction. Every correction deepens alignment. This creates compounding effect. Small changes accumulate, gradually shifting the entire configuration, without visible disruption. At this point, resistance becomes counterproductive. If the system tries to resist, it increases internal instability, because resistance conflicts with its own behavior. So the system avoids resistance, not consciously, but structurally. Adaptation becomes the only viable response. This is when control becomes irreversible, because the system is no longer opposing direction. It is generating it from within. At this level, influence becomes indistinguishable from evolution. Changes appear natural, necessary, inevitable. There is no external cause, only internal development. This removes suspicion completely, because nothing appears imposed, everything appears emergent. At this point, timing changes again. You no longer act in moments, you act in conditions. You design structures that unfold over time. The system moves, even in your absence, because movement is built into its configuration. At this level, scale increases, because self-reconfiguration applies across entire systems, not just individual elements. The effect spreads, through relationships, through dependencies, through internal adjustments. One change triggers another, then another, until the system reorganizes itself. At this point, control becomes systemic, not local. You are no longer influencing parts. You are influencing the whole, through structure. At this level, the system no longer resists, not because it cannot, but because resistance no longer functions. It does not solve the problem, so the system abandons it. This is the final shift, from opposition to alignment, not forced, but constructed. At this point, the system has adapted completely. Its behavior reflects the structure you introduced. Its movement follows the direction you defined. And its outcomes are no longer accidental. They are the result of configuration. At this level, control disappears, because nothing looks controlled. Everything looks natural, but the direction was never random. Structural invisibility. Once systems begin to reconfigure themselves, a final transition takes place. Not in behavior, not in structure, but in perception. Because at this level, control no longer needs to act. It no longer needs to signal. It no longer needs to appear. At lower levels, control is always visible. It manifests through intervention, through force, through correction. Something moves because something caused it to move. This creates traceability, a visible relationship between action and outcome. And wherever that relationship exists, control can be identified, measured, challenged, because it is external, separate from the system itself. At higher levels, this separation disappears. Control no longer sits outside the system. It becomes embedded within it, not as a force, but as a condition. This is the shift. You are no longer influencing behavior. You are defining the structure that makes behavior inevitable. At this point, systems no longer respond to direction. They respond to configuration. They act according to the pathways available. And those pathways have already been shaped. This creates a different form of movement, not reactive, not directed, but emergent. The system behaves as if it is operating freely, adjusting, optimizing, selecting from available options. But those options are not neutral. They are structured. At this level, influence disappears because it is no longer required. There is no need to push, no need to guide, no need to intervene, because the system is already aligned with the outcome. At lower levels, control requires effort, constant input, continuous correction. Because systems resist external pressure, they push back, adapt against force. But once control becomes structural, resistance loses its function, because there is nothing external to resist, no opposing force, no visible pressure, only environment. And systems do not resist environment. They adapt to it, automatically. At this point, behavior stabilizes, not through enforcement, but through limitation. The system can only move within the structure available. And when that structure is aligned, every possible movement leads to the same direction. This creates consistency, without control signals, without correction, without intervention. At this level, outcomes repeat, not because they are imposed, but because alternatives do not exist. The system selects freely, but all selections converge. This is structural inevitability, not prediction, not probability, but constraint. The system is not forced to behave a certain way. It is simply unable to behave otherwise. At this point, visibility disappears completely, because nothing stands out. There is no event, no intervention, no visible influence, only normal operation. And normal operation is never questioned. At lower levels, control is detected through disruption, something unusual, something that breaks pattern. But at this level, nothing breaks pattern. Everything appears consistent, continuous, expected. This removes detection entirely, because there is nothing to detect. At this point, control becomes indistinguishable from reality. The system does not feel guided. It feels natural. It feels correct. It feels self-generated. And that is what makes it stable. Because systems only resist what feels imposed. They do not resist what feels inherent. At this level, intervention becomes unnecessary, because the system sustains itself. Every action reinforces the structure. Every outcome stabilizes it further. This creates self-reinforcing alignment, not temporary, but persistent. At this point, scale expands again, because structural control is not limited to single systems. It can extend across multiple, each one aligned through shared constraints. This creates unified behavior, across environments, across interactions, without coordination. At this level, systems do not need to communicate to align. They share structure, and structure defines behavior. At this point, control reaches its final form. Not force, not influence, not leverage, but architecture. The ability to define what is possible and what is not. At this level, power is no longer expressed. It is embedded, not visible, not traceable, not resistible. Because it does not act, it exists. And when control exists as structure, there is no longer a distinction between system behavior and directed outcome. The system is not being influenced. It is functioning exactly as configured. Most systems collapse when pressure becomes visible. At higher levels, pressure is absorbed, integrated into behavior. And once that happens, control no longer appears as force. It appears as reality. The next chapter is not about systems interacting, but about perception itself. Because once perception shifts, systems are no longer something you navigate. They become something you interpret.